Okay, so I mentioned we have a Viking riding from Oklahoma and a student of our Ken Schooland, professor of entrepreneurship and research fellow at the Mises Institute, who's going to talk about, well, you've seen the book, How to Think About Economy, um, how we really need sound economy, because, well, we do. So a big applause for Per Bylund.
Okay, thank you. Is this on? Yeah, okay. So I think we have the answer to how many libertarians does it take to find a number between 1 and 20. And apparently the answer is 35 or about there. So that's impressive. So let's see, what is the title of my talk? Right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why good libertarianism, sound libertarianism, requires a good economic understanding and a good theory of how the economy actually works. Because we have a lot of libertarians, and I think you agree with me, that sort of go the wrong way in all kinds of ways, usually because they have a faulty understanding of the economy. And I mean, you can't really blame them because they haven't all been Ken students. But as Ken student, I can tell you something about what I learned, the little that I actually retained. Because as a student, most of what you're taught, you forget, right? Okay, so most important thing first, follow me on Twitter, excuse me, X. Follow me on X. So you got my handle right there. All right, so when we're talking about the free market, and of course in here we talk about the free market as something really free, not just the Republican Party version, but an actual free market. There are all kinds of conceptions of what that actually means, and all kinds of misconceptions, especially of what the free market means. What does that mean for a society? What is a free market society like? Well, a lot of people would get something like this image in their minds, saying that, oh, look at that, the free market will create a lot of housing, but they will create even more homeless people. So you will have a lot of deserted, empty houses, and you will have a lot of people living who have no access to houses. A lot of the people on the left would criticize us for this, right? Because they have a conception of what the free market means in the economy, and it means to them, their conclusion is this. Strangely, this is very much like a Chinese ghost city, right? Where you produce a whole city of housing and no one moves there. So apparently we have something in common with the Chinese Communist Party in libertarianism. We do the same thing, right? We want a system where there's a lot of housing produced, but no one actually moves there. Or they're doing something wrong, right? There's something wrong with this conclusion, and we know it's wrong because we know that the free market will create better housing, more housing, and more affordable housing for people, so you would have less of the homeless problem. But how do we explain that? And how do we make it intuitive for them? And how do we make sure that we as libertarians don't make the mistakes that many libertarians actually make? Well, the first question to ask, of course, is what does freedom actually look like? Well, freedom means that people are free. So free people means free markets. People can interact in whatever way they like. They can choose not to work, or they can choose to work a lot. They can become entrepreneurs or what have you. But what do they actually look like? What can we say about how a free market society would be like? What is the structure of it? How can we be sure that a free market society, because there is none, right? None of the countries in this world are free market countries. So what can we say about it, and how can we be sure? How can we convey this picture of this future in an intuitive way, and how can we be sure that what we actually believe is correct? It's not that obvious, right? Who will build the roads? Can there be roads without politicians and bureaucrats? So in order to do this, we need a sound theory of the economy, because the economy is society, especially when we're talking about the free market. Because when we're talking about the total free society and free market without any restrictions, any regulations, and so forth, there's no difference really between the economy and society, right? Because whenever all our interactions, all our choices to produce and consume and what have you, they're because we're free individuals. It's also because we're engaging in a free market. There's no difference. Society and economy are really just two different terms for the same thing. They're synonymous. They're not synonymous today with a big government. They're not synonymous today with a regulatory interventionist government. But in a free society, they would be the same thing. So I see the free society and the free economy as two sides of the same coin. And I think that is important to recognize to begin with. Of course, we also need a good theory of the economy, good understanding of the economy, to recognize what is actually wrong. Yeah, the ethical argument is obvious, because you have all these politicians deciding what we can and cannot do. But how wrong is the outcome? Is it just that we get a little less? We're a little less rich than we otherwise would be? Or is it that society is completely different? And how can we tell? How can we know that what we're promoting and what we're advocating is different or not compared to what we actually have today? Those are questions that we have to be able to answer, and I think a good theory of the economy, good understanding of the economy will help us do this. Because there are not only direct impositions of the state. Usually when we talk about regulations, we talk about regulations as this restriction right now, and we talk about the seen and the unseen. Well, there's more to the story. There isn't only the seen and the unseen, because as we'll get to later, the economy is a process, and a process, it takes another step based on what was already done in the previous steps. It's cumulative, right? So we're going to go through that a little bit. Now, what we need to recognize is that the freedom is decentralized. It is not hierarchical, it's not vertical, it's horizontal. What society looks like emerges bottom up because it's just whatever happens, whatever orders are created when we interact with each other. Sometimes we call these spontaneous orders. We can call them whatever we like, emergent orders. But the fact is that there is some sort of structure, some sort of order to it that no one has produced. There's no blueprint for society because it just happens. And of course, it will change over time as well. So it's not the case that we will get to a certain point and then we're done. No, it will always evolve, it will always unfold, and that's important to recognize as well, because that's going to tell us something about how the society works overall. Well, that too means that we need a serious, sound theory, a serious understanding of how the economy works, because otherwise, how can we tell if we're moving in the right direction or if we're moving in the wrong direction? And frankly, what the heck does right and wrong direction mean? In order to know that, we also need a proper, sound understanding of the economy. So they're very different things, right? So as you can see up here, the image or the GIF to some, it's a flock of starlings. And how are they organized? Is it the case that they're all provided with a blueprint to begin with, and then fly in this direction, fly in this manner? No, they're all reacting and interacting with each other, and they're creating these patterns when they're flying. And it's easy to tell that, well, if they didn't do that, then how the heck would you get these patterns, and why would they not crash into each other? Well, the same thing in the economy. Maybe not that we crash into each other, but our actions and interactions horizontally will create certain structures of outcome, and they will provide us with opportunities for the future. So we can use this as an analogy for free society and for the free economy. Now, the problem that we have is that a lot of free market people subscribe to what I would call a faulty view of the economy because they're subscribing to a faulty theory of the economy or theory of economics. And one way I usually put it is that most Austrians are libertarians. That's true, but most libertarians are not Austrians, and that's a problem. The problem of that is that, well, most people, they subscribe to what I refer to as the gang sign of economists. You know that, right? How many of you are economists? So you know the gang sign? No? Supply and demand? Right? So that's what you learn in grad school. You get a PhD and you learn to just greet each other like this. No, but seriously, a lot of people, they think of the economy in terms of just shifting curves or maybe even equations if they're advanced, but they're not thinking about the economy as a process that it unfolds, so they're missing a lot of the picture, right? You have some of the concepts here, general equilibrium. You're analyzing the economy based off of a view of equilibrium. Are we in equilibrium or are we a little bit off equilibrium, in disequilibrium? And how much of a problem is that? Are we in the perfectly competitive model, and we get back to that, is a perfect example, no pun intended, of this. The circular flow, that money just goes around and around and around. It opens up for thinking that, well, the problem is that there's not enough money going around and around and around. Or maybe there is too much, so someone needs to go in there and control it, much like you control the temperature of the room with a thermostat, right? You just dial it up or dial it down depending on if it's too hot or too cold. That's the outcome of thinking of the economy in this way, right? You have a faulty conception. So some of the mistakes that come from this faulty conception of the economy these are a couple of the mistakes, a couple of big ones, and I'm sure you've heard of these. If you think of the economy as a perfectly equilibrated system or a perfect competition model, then you can always identify, well, the economy, the real economy doesn't actually work like, or it doesn't look like what the model says that it should look like. So the models, especially since it's called perfect, it seems like it's normative. It's a goal, right? It's an ideal. So that's where we should be. So if we're not there, someone should make sure that we get there. That's the obvious conclusion. A 5-year-old can figure that out, right? Well, that's a problem, because a perfectly competitive model is based off of such things as perfect information, no transaction costs, things like that. Well, that's totally unrealistic. So it's basically saying that, well, if the economy does not function like an economy of 8 billion gods interacting, then government should step in and help those gods become gods. Well, you can tell how weird this sort of reasoning is, right? And then you will have to use all kinds of strange arguments in order to make that seem much more reasonable, like animal spirits or something like that. Okay, so many, you probably encountered this too, on the left will say that, well, free market is a nice idea, but it could never work, much like some of us might say about communism. Why do they say that? Well, because they would then refer to the Chicago school or mainstream economics view of perfect competition, saying, well, see, in the economy, people don't have perfect information. In the economy, there are transaction costs, so someone has to step in and help people do the right thing. That is the obvious solution. So they're using economics against us, which is ridiculous in a sense, but still, it seems like they're then producing an argument that makes sense because they misunderstand the economy. And this is a huge problem, of course, because that if you compare anything real with an ideal world that doesn't exist, that is unrealistic, you're always going to find that the real world is faulty. You're always going to find that the real world has all these weaknesses, shortcomings, and that, of course, also implies that someone can step in and fix those, assuming that we have perfect information, which, of course, do not. They also suggest that there has to be a government, because who else would step into the economy and help us out? Because we're just individuals. We can't do anything. And the whole issue with not being in perfectly competitive equilibrium is that we couldn't get there. So someone else has to step in. So there's already an argument for government because of this model. I think you can see the problem. There's no end to what the government must attempt to do, and there's an argument for the government already in the model. because we misunderstand the economy. This is a huge problem. Now, a better view of the economy, of course, is to see the economy as a process. That it doesn't really have an end point. It doesn't really have a perfect situation. It's constantly figuring stuff out. It's a constant discovery process, if you will. It's trying to solve problems because entrepreneurs make money off of solving problems, and they make money off of creating value for consumers. Okay, fine. Good idea. But it also means that it's never maximized. Right? So we can always make it a little better. We can always try to solve more problems. We can always discover more problems. But in order to discover a new problem, we have to solve the old one first. So of course it's going to be unfolding. And this is a whole lot better conception of the economy. I think you agree with me, right? And it places entrepreneurship at the very core. It means that we can't really know what is going to be a solution to the problem, because if we knew, well, why did we not produce the solution to the problem before? So all these entrepreneurs are competing by producing all these solutions that they hope will be of value to consumers after the fact. Right? When they present the goods and services to consumers, will consumers actually say, ah, yeah, good idea, I'll part with my money to buy that thing? Or will they not? I mean, that's profit or loss. So there's uncertainty involved immediately when you think about the economy as a process. It is necessarily not efficient in the economic sense, because there's always more you can do. The question then is, are you doing enough? And how do you direct resources towards the greater good or the higher value? Well, Mises solved it through the argument for economic calculation, saying that, well, the only reason the market works and the reason nothing else works is because all these entrepreneurs, they're competing with each other in trying to figure out how to best serve consumers in the future, and thereby they're picking inputs to use in a way that they can make the most profit. And by doing that, they're also bidders for those resources. So they're also determining, as a group, as a collective, they're determining the prices of these inputs. So the inputs will be priced based off of the expected value that they can contribute to. And in that sense, the market will always not follow consumer preferences and consumer value, but instead try to predict and produce goods that are expected to have the highest valued outcomes, which is an important distinction. Now, Joseph Schumpeter, you can argue if he was an Austrian or not, but he was from the beginning anyway. He put this in a different way than Mises, but it's really referring to the same thing. And he said that the problem that is usually being visualized is how capitalism administers existing structures, whereas that's not really the problem. The problem is not the management of what exists, those businesses that exist, the production structures that exist, because they have already been put there by someone, and they're already in use. The problem is which ones should not be in use, which ones should be replaced by something else, and who the heck determines? Who decides what should be replacing what? Well, the entrepreneur does that, right? So the real problem is how capitalism, as he preferred to call it, or the free market, if you will, how capitalism decides which production process should end now, which should instead be created. That's the real process, not the production itself, because that's fairly easy, and that's management. The real problem is entrepreneurship, innovation. So he called the whole free market as it was a process of industrial mutation. Yeah, it's all constantly changing and evolving and reacting to whatever variables are out there, whatever parameters are out there, whatever limitations, boundaries, and so forth, trying to find a way. Much like water will find a way, and if you try to block a river with a big rock, it's not going to stop the river. The river is going to continue flowing, but in different directions. You don't really know where it's going to go to. You know it's going to go down, but where? You don't know. So it's really dangerous to try to block the river, because you're dealing with a huge force and you can't really tell where the water is going to end up. So you might cause a flooding and cause a lot of harm just because you place a rock in the river. Well, the problem here is that we get more mistakes. Because even if you accept that the market is a process, you could make all these different conclusions that are not accurate. So you can say, well, what we need is, of course, more entrepreneurs. So, and we've been talking about this earlier in the week, if we can just create more entrepreneurs, we would get more growth, we would get more wealth, we would solve more problems. So maybe then the government can step in and subsidize entrepreneurs. Maybe they can say, you know what, how about a universal basic income for people to start a business? Well, how many here thinks that that's a good idea? No, they're going to start all kinds of crappy businesses. We don't want to use scarce resources for creating crappy things. We want to use those resources in the best way possible. So that's a potential problem, even if you understand the economy as a process that is not in equilibrium. Of course, in policy, you would also then subsidize all kinds of innovations. We tend to think of innovation as something that is always good. Well, that means that the more innovation we have, the better is the economy, the better off we are. So if we can just get everybody to innovate, then we're going to be really rich. Well, the problem is that innovation takes resources, and innovation is uncertain. So more innovation is not necessarily better. There is an optimal point or an optimal volume, quantity of innovation. If you don't recognize that, then of course the government should step in and they should create all kinds of incubators and things like that to help entrepreneurs create their businesses. And hey, the space program, maybe the government should create a big space program and pump in billions and billions of dollars into it because, oh, look at all those spillover innovations that will help people. Or maybe the government can step in and create synthetic rubber so we don't need to rely on natural rubber. And then that would be a great step forward. Well, no, because if that was actually a good step forward and it was actually valuable, entrepreneurs would probably figure out a way to do it anyway. So the government is not needed, but that's a conclusion that if you don't have a full understanding, or at least a broad understanding of how the economy works, well, you're going to end up with these wrong conclusions. So what I tried to, well, this is missing a lot of information, but I tried to figure this out and tried to discuss this in a very short book that is sold out outside. How to think about the economy, but it exists in several different languages. And there is the Spanish version, which is recently released, which you can pick up outside for just $2. So most of these can also be downloaded for free. But where does this take us then? If we have a proper understanding of the economy, what do we actually know? Well, it turns out, and this is the point in red is something that I gave a talk on at a world conference a few years ago in Puerto Rico, that even libertarians, that's you guys, you don't understand. You have no idea how destructive regulations really are. You think they're really bad, but they're really worse. So you have no clue. And the issue here is, well, we'll get to that. But yes, regulations are restrictions on people's actions. They're restrictions on what entrepreneurs can do. They're restrictions on what types of projects they can undertake and invest in. Well, we know this. We know that there are effective and ineffective regulations. So a minimum wage of 0 would not make a whole lot of difference. And a minimum wage of $1,000 an hour would make a lot of difference. Not very good difference, but it would cost change, right? And of course, any policy, any regulation wants to be effective. The whole point of it is to create a change in the economy. So ineffective regulations, no politician wants ineffective regulations. They want effective regulations. They want to create as much effect and outcome as possible. They want to change what is going on. They want to make sure you don't do that or that you do that, right? That's the whole point of regulating the economy. Just like you use a thermostat in a room, like a very hot one like this, and try to push the temperature down. You want to cause a change. No one wants just a thermostat that doesn't have any function, that doesn't cause a change. You want a thermostat that actually causes a change. The same with regulations. Okay, so what is the impact of regulations? Well, we already know the seen and the unseen, and you've all heard of those concepts before, right? Both from Frederick Bastiat and Henry Hazlitt. So we know that part. Well, there's so much more to it. If the economy is actually a process, it tells us something much, much more, because the process, well, imagine it was going in this direction. And then you implement one regulation that says, well, entrepreneurs cannot invest here, in this little piece here. Okay, fine. Is the process going to continue just like before without that little piece? No, but that's what the seen and the unseen would suggest, that we don't get that. That's the unseen. We would have gotten that without the regulation. Well, the problem is that these entrepreneurs, or other entrepreneurs, they would take the resources, they would invest them elsewhere, right? That's pretty obvious. They wouldn't just say, regulations here. Well, no one will hire these workers or build these factories or use this land. We'll just leave those resources on the side. No, of course not. They're going to use those resources for the second best project. So they're going to produce something else instead. Well, the next generation entrepreneurs, they're going to react on what is being produced. They're going to continue to develop products, and they're going to take some of the information, some of the knowledge that we learned from these entrepreneurs, and they're going to use that in creating something new. Much like the iPhone, the smartphone, was built off of the iPod, which in turn was built off of something else, right? You couldn't get to the iPhone without the iPod. It's impossible. You don't take those huge leaps, not only because you as an entrepreneur can't figure it out, because sometimes you can, but your consumers can't figure it out. They're not used to it. They don't understand what you're saying, so they're not going to buy it. So by regulating a little bit here, you're going to shift all of investments a little bit. Well, the next generation of investments, maybe next year, maybe next decade, they're going to build off of what's actually being invested. So this one regulation at year 0 is going to have an effect every damn year, because the market process is cumulative. Okay? So entrepreneurs, they will do something else. They will invest in production somewhere else. They will hire workers somewhere else. There will be demand for resources, whether they're workers or stuff or land or whatever else, somewhere else. Not where entrepreneurs thought that consumers would be best off, but somewhere else. And then someone else will build off of those ideas and continue investing in that direction. Then imagine, we're just talking about one regulation here. Imagine if there are several regulations. We're all from countries where there are thousands and thousands and thousands of regulations. And they've been in place and enforced for maybe 1,000 years. What is the outcome of that process? How similar is our society today, our economy today, to what otherwise would have been the case? Well, not very similar at all, probably. If you have, say, 1,000 years of entrepreneurs and investments made based off of these investments that were already redirected by regulations, well, then we're going to end up somewhere completely different from where we otherwise would have been if entrepreneurs could follow simply where consumers would probably have wanted them to go. Okay? This, of course, means that we have a lower standard of living overall, because we get on a lower trajectory instead of going this direction. Well, they can't create as much value as they otherwise would, so they're going to create a little less value, but they're still going to pursue profit and pursue production, so they're going to be a little bit flatter. Well, then add a few more regulations. It's going to be flatter and flatter. And then add thousands of years of cumulative process. Where are we at then? Well, we're nowhere close to the wealth and prosperity that we would have seen in the world without regulations. That's kind of a problem, right? Okay, so I discussed this concept in my previous book, The Seen, the Unseen, and the Unrealized. Let's talk about one example before I quit. Sweatshops. So, you all know the story about sweatshops. Everybody hates sweatshops because they hire people at terrible work conditions. It's hot, much like a libertarian conference. You work long hours. You have no safety. You have a boss that's terrible, all of this stuff, right? So everybody in the West would hate sweatshops, and they're saying they're exploiting and taking advantage of these poor workers in these poor countries. No, 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 says the libertarian usually. That's not the case, because look at their actual options. Look at the choices they make, that if they did not work in the sweatshop, what would they do then? Well, they would probably be toiling in the fields, starving. Maybe their daughters would be prostitutes just to feed the family. So obviously the sweatshop is a whole lot better. Well, that's the seen and the unseen, right? That's now. But what about cumulatively? Looking at it as a process. Well, then it's different, right? Because then if you think about it, how come there is this one sweatshop that all these people are lining up to sign up and become employed there? Why is there only one? How come no one else started a second one? Why is there not competition between two sweatshops in the same village or the same region? Why is there only one? Wouldn't it be the case if it was a free market that someone would say, oh, I can make a bunch of money by paying people a lot of more than they're actually making already. I can start a sweatshop here. Well, if the economy supports that, if the economy is enough for you to actually create the sweatshop and produce a supply chain and what have you and pay them more, isn't the economy also then open for someone else to do the same thing? Wouldn't someone else be able to create a sweatshop next door and say, I offer a little bit more of air conditioning, a little shorter hours, and I pay a little more. So I get the better workers. Well, of course. Of course, that's going to happen. Why doesn't that happen? Why is it the case that there is a sweatshop where people, yes, they get paid more than they otherwise would make, all else held constant? But why isn't it the case that there are several sweatshops available that offer better and better terms in poor countries, producing sneakers for Nike or whatever it is? Why is that not the case? What about that unrealized opportunity that is not there for these poor workers? How come this country is poor is another question to ask, right? Well, the only reason that this other sweatshop is not created, unless it is a sweatshop that has sort of a natural monopoly because the economy doesn't support more, but that's hardly ever the case. The reason there's only one is because politics has opened up for one sweatshop and they will not allow more. They will not allow the market process. That's what's keeping these people poor. That's what's keeping these poor people in the situation where they have to choose between the one sweatshop and toiling in the fields. The market would say, ooh, here's a sweatshop, and then someone else would say, I want to create one too. And they would create another sweatshop next door, and they would compete for the workers, and few people would be toiling in the fields. I think you can see how important it is to think about the economy as a process with people acting and reacting to the opportunities they have. And you also see the problem here with regulations. When it restricts people's choices, entrepreneurs' choices in investing and producing, it changes completely the outcome. It changes completely society's wealth, yes, but it changes completely our options in our everyday lives. Not only products, but our careers, our investment opportunities, our choice to stay at home and do nothing because, hey, the currency is deflating rather than inflating. What would not be possible without regulations? There's something to think about, I think, and something that if you have a proper, sound conception of economics, you can see just how terrible this world is, not in itself, because it's not, it's wonderful, but how terrible this world is because we have politicians, because we have regulations. That's why we're dirt poor, even the richest among us. That's why we don't have a cure for cancer. That's why we don't have vacations on Jupiter or whatever. Those things we would already have probably, were it not for regulations. So that's why I said even libertarians don't understand how destructive regulations truly are. Thank you.
Have enough time for questions.
Cheers.
I like how you ended, and it reminds me of Mary Ruart's book, which is sitting out on the table if it's not sold out, Death by Regulation. I have found that book just overwhelming. I bought a dozen copies and gave it to other doctors, and I got very little positive feedback, which just deeply disappointed me, but I think it demonstrated very well what you said. So this is more just a comment than a question.
Okay, thank you. That's a good comment. I think that's exactly the case. That we need to inform people not only of what would be possible or how many people are dying because of regulations, but also try to help them understand how the economy actually works, because that means they can draw these conclusions themselves. Simon.
I want to be the true libertarian and not understanding regulations in a sense that, you know, Mazzucato makes the claim that GPS would not have been done without the government. Think of, for example, the warp speed operation during Trump's presidency. Can we sort of have maybe faith in governments and states' powers for some projects like that, especially with that need huge amounts of money from the get-go that possibly could not have been invested from the private sector? And more importantly, what about public goods in general as a concept that, again, the Chicago people love and some Austrians as well?
Okay, yeah, good question. So I think the government is really good at one thing, and it's war. Whether it's a war on other peoples or it's their own people. So I don't think the market can be better at government than government at war. So that's one thing. I think the issue with all this, yes, we wouldn't have the GPS were it not for the space program or what have you. Department of Defense created the internet and all this else. But that's also, the problem here is that we're looking at what we have. We don't really know what we would have had. So we might have had some sort of network like the internet before, even earlier without regulations, or we might have had something much better. The only thing we can say about this is that because of this investment by government, entrepreneurs did not pursue the highest valued ends for consumers. So instead, the government stepped in and did something that the government thought was better, and we got a lot of things out of that, but it's necessarily on a lower trajectory. There's no way we can say that, well, yeah, the government is wiser than entrepreneurs. And of course, no one believes that in here. Could we say that, well, sometimes the government is just by pure luck, they create more value than entrepreneurs would be able to? Well, that's possible, but why would we invest society's wealth into pure luck? I mean, why would we hope that politicians are lucky? It would be better to take the national budget and go to Las Vegas and put it all on roulette or something, right? That would probably give us more outcome than the government playing that same game. So we get stuff out of it, yes. The government creates something that is more than nothing, but compared to what? We have to compare to the stuff that we would have gotten otherwise, right? And for public goods, there are very few public goods that actually mean something. Right? So yes, there are goods that are unrivalrous and so forth. But don't entrepreneurs figure out a way to provide us with what we find valuable if they can make a profit out of it? I mean, most of the definition of it and the examples of it are examples based off of the gang sign. Right? If you don't have a gang sign view of the economy, but instead it's a process, public goods tend to disappear. And they tend to disappear when entrepreneurs collectively figure out ways of providing those services. And is it really the case? Would you really assume that everybody wants a solution to this problem and all entrepreneurs go, nah, I mean, that's a public good. I'm not going to do that. No, of course not. They're going to figure out a way of doing it. And there are ways of providing public goods by simply making them non-public goods. right? By making them a subscription service or bundling with something else. There are plenty of solutions to public goods problems in the economy already.
Thank you very much. Really, really enjoyed your approach to clearly and succinctly explaining economy, so thank you. And you very briefly touched on monopolies, natural monopolies, and the free market self-regulation upon it. If you could expand, that would be great, as to how the free market prevents monopoly and how monopolies are government created versus natural monopolies, if you would, please.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
So, I mean, monopoly means only one seller. That's what the term actually means. Well, think about it. Where would you find a monopoly most often? Well, that's with innovation, because any innovation is necessarily one seller to begin with. Is that a problem? No, we would usually think that an innovation is the opposite of a problem, right? So having one seller is not an issue. The problem is if others cannot copy what you're doing, if others cannot be inspired by what you're doing and doing something, and maybe not copy straight off, but at least mimic what you're doing and doing something better, right? So if the first iPhone had a patent in the sense that no one else could pursue smartphones, then we would still only have iPhones. They would probably not be as good because there would be no competition. But because Samsung and others could copy the concept and do similar things, we have much, much better phones. Right? So it's not really about how many businesses produce a certain product. It's can other entrepreneurs do similar things. So the problem with monopoly is the regulation of monopoly. When the government says, there's one seller of this, and we're not going to let anyone else do something similar. That's when you get the problem, because that's a position where that company can exploit the situation. Right? They can limit their outputs, they can raise prices, they can create a crappy product as long as it's not sufficiently crappy to make consumers go somewhere else. Right? So as long as there's some value in it, they might be able to make a buck. But they're protected by government. Imagine someone trying to do this in the free market if there's not protection by government. Well, then anyone, as soon as you raise the price a little too much or you don't innovate enough, then someone else would be able to enter the market, steal some of your market share, and compete for the profit. So I think a competitive market can be defined by having at least one producer. Not more than one, at least one, as long as you have low barriers to entry. So high barriers to entry is the problem, not the number of businesses producing it. I mean, it doesn't really matter how many dry cleaners you have in a city. Dry cleaning in exactly the same way. Well, who cares? If it's one company or 1,000, it doesn't matter. What matters is that someone else can start a new one if they misbehave. That's the control. And that's what the market does.
Thank you very much for interesting and clear explanations how free market economy should look like. And my question is about regulations. So yeah, that's right. Regulations can be really harmful in different spheres of our, let's say, life or reality. But it looks like for me that people really want these regulations, because if there are a lot of regulations, people do not need to take, decisions, do not make choices and so on. So my question is, how can we educate people? How can we explain that it's important to take decisions on their own and so on? And it does not only deal with free market, but for example, in my case, it deals with civil society and non-governmental organizations and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think the solution is to teach them economic thinking, to think better about the economy. So in a sense, you should all buy 10 or 12 copies of my book and give it to your friends. But seriously, just talking about the economy in the sense that it makes it intuitive for what is actually going on. Because it's very easy to point fingers at the oligarchs or what have you. But how come there are oligarchs? That's a real question. How come they remain oligarchs? Those are the questions, because it is a process, right? They didn't come from nowhere, and there's a reason why they remain oligarchs. And it's probably not because entrepreneurs are trying to beat them and be much more effective, and they can't. That's usually not the case. It's because they're protected. So I think just introducing the idea of the economy as a process, a proper, sound description of the process, helps a lot, because it gives people an intuition for how it actually works. And then you can tell them, well, introducing this one regulation, it's going to cause all these problems. And we have thousands and thousands and thousands of these regulations. So guess what the outcome is like? Is the outcome actually in line with consumers' best interests or with someone else's better interests?
Okay, well, I have already cut the line before, so I will only allow one scolding comment from the proud father, Ken, if he has one.
Brilliant presentation. I applaud your teacher. He must have been very pleased with the student. So many people argue that, well, the only reason that people innovate is because they get a promise of a patent that will give them exclusivity and cut off all competition in the future. On the other hand, isn't a patent a barrier to entry? How does this fit into the idea of innovation?
Yeah, good question. I think you're right that my teacher was awesome. Yeah, the role of patents is really a subsidy to the innovator. So whoever comes up with the idea, not necessarily the person who implements it and does something good for consumers, but who comes up with the idea, gets the right to it, and no one else can do it. So what does that give us? Well, since it is a subsidy, it gives us a lot more ideas that are patentable and fewer ideas that are not patentable, because we're shifting investments away from, say, supplements and natural cures toward pharma, where you can patent different types of pills that have to be produced chemically. Right? So you have already a distortion of investments right there. And of course, we get more innovation than we otherwise would have. So instead of solving everyday problems for consumers, you would have a lot of investors and entrepreneurs focusing on creating a patent that they can exploit in the future. Well, that doesn't solve any problem to have a patent. And it certainly doesn't solve our everyday problems. So it's a shift also away from the welfare of the consumers to the welfare of innovators, or inventors really, whether or not they serve consumers, which is really the worst part of it. Because in entrepreneurship, anyone knows if you're not protected as an entrepreneur, you do not make profits by having the best idea, but by having the best implementation. Plenty of groundbreaking products were not the first attempt, but it was the best attempt according to customers. So by patenting the first version of the idea, giving that person a monopoly for however many decades, that means you're not going to get the better implementation until after the patent expires. Well, that means that we're delaying all these satisfaction, all these good products and services and solutions that we otherwise would get. So the same thing applies there as in any place else. It's a regulation. It's a pretty bad one in this case that completely distorts the market economy and completely distorts what is produced for real people, consumers.
Okay, thank you again, Per.
Thank you.
Wonderful presentation. And I know